Unit 6, Consequences of Industrialization. 6.1, Rationales for Imperialism from 1715 to 1900. One of the major effects of the Industrial Revolution across the world was the new wave of empire building. 3 reasons for imperialization that spiked during this time period was because of culture, nationalism, and economics. Most were made by European powers, but not all, but most. This is an important factor. Europeans believed in 2 things: superiority of the white race and superiority of the culture of the. So their immediate thoughts were to expand because they thought it was their duty in life. This is also known as the white man's burden. A second cultural reason for imperialism has to do with Darwin's theory. Darwin's theory was taught in their natural order: the strong eat the weak and the fittest survive. This is referred as to social Darwinism as a whole. The rational part comes from the idea that social Darwinism can be applied to nations that strong nations can eat the weak in this case. The third cultural region was religion. The spread of European Christianity was huge during this area. The missionaries' goal was to spread, but they also made schools that focused on other things like math and science. They also built hospitals, and some of these endeavors helped abolish the slave trade. Nationalism. After losing their American colonies, they set out to find more places to overcome, hence the term nationalism. They wanted to nationalize these places in order to expand and grow. Most valuable places Britain took control of was India. This led to Japan to build their empire and imperialize economics. Everybody needs more raw materials, more factoring goods, and Britain needed trading ports to colonize in certain areas, leading to more wealth. 6.2, State Expansion 1715 to 1900. Imperialism into Africa and Asia. European expansion in Africa has to do a lot with the trading posts. One reason was to get a shortened travel to Asia on sea-based routes. So this started with building a canal across Egypt. The problem is that Britain desired more and more as they were growing, so they started holding colonies in Africa by force, establishing settler colonies. Everybody wanted a piece of Africa. This is known as the scramble for Africa. They set up a Berlin Conference to establish which country is going to get which area of Africa to avoid conflict. Unfortunately, this caused more problems with the resting African colonies. Berlin settled into Africa in a way that was quite different from the West by using forced labor to earn wealth. Expansion into India. Britain became more power-hungry and started to expand even more across India. This eventually conquered all of India. They started out with their own troops and slowly introduced Indian troops. China. Europe used economic imperialism in China. China was suffering from their own mistakes, so Europe came to help support to get Europe on their feet. As a result, Europe demanded trading posts in China, and this leads to spheres of influence. Japan suddenly became colonized and wanted to grow, so they expanded over Korea, Pacific Islands, and some parts of China. They didn't work as well in the end, because they were colonized and occupied. 6.3, Indigenous responses to state expansion 1715 to 1900. Indigenous responses. As imperial nations began to expand, the indigenous people had the urge for nationalism. This led to resistance. Americas. As the British colonized in America began to push the native people's land, they made some deals. But later, American settlers found gold on their land, so they set a deal with the Congress, the Indian Removal Act. This led to known as the Trail of the Tears along the Oklahoma Territory. Native Americans resisted and known as the Ghost Dance. Mexico. The Mexicans wanted no foreign conflict, but eventually the French made a deal, but got outcasted a few years later by Mexican rebellions. Australia. The British established the Penal colony in Australia. They were supposed to no conflict, but British settlers started taking over and there was a rebellion against the British by the natives, but the British military crushed them as a result. 6.3, Indigenous. I'm still on that. Africa. Europe would set up separate governments as they colonized parts of Africa, but in South Africa, there was one native colony that rebelled. This led to the 40-year battle against each other. West Africa. Sokoto Caliphate. This established a thriving economy. This resulted in some conflict with the French, the rebellion against the British. East Africa. The British wanted to take control of the Suez Canal in Sudan. This led to the Manhez Revolt. 6.4 Global Economic Development 1715 to 1900s. Economics is the biggest driving force of the imperial expansion. Nations grew to their max capacity, and this they would need two things: raw materials and food. Agriculture. Africa was key to European imperialism. When Europeans started showing up, they noticed that Africans were using a kind of farming called subsistence farming, but they didn't like that, so they replaced it with more cash crop farming. The growing of the middle class was a big deal for agriculture, so they needed more food, mostly meat, raw materials. They were in desperate need for manufacturing factories. Europe turned to their colonies for raw materials, cotton. Britain was set up on cotton from the Americas, but they broke out into civil war, so the production dropped, so they moved to Egypt and India. Rubber. Rubber was a big deal. This would close in South America. Natives to work as rubber extractions at a low wage work, whatever. So so Britain can manufacture rubber and profit off of it. 6.5 Economic Imperialism from 1715 to 1900. Imperialism was more of an economic reality than a political. Economic imperialism. One country has significant economic power over another country. Asia. This is an example in Asia. It is all settled from the British East Indian Company. Got its start from the 1600s for spice trade. Britain started to get more political power, and they started exporting cotton for profit. China. The British had huge demand for porcelain, silk, and tea. That they imported these goods in mass quantities, but Britain was interested in Chinese goods, so when the Chinese were interested in British goods. Silver prices were beginning to decrease the British East India Co. produced opium, which led to the rise in addiction, then led to the Opium Wars. Opening more trade in China led to everybody wanting a piece in China, and that led to a spirit they had to exclusive trading rights. Latin America. The United States, Britain, and Spain had a huge interest in Latin America in the mid-19th century. They were all seeking raw materials, low-wage workers, and marketing goods. The Monroe Doctrine, that the lion's share, the British, Western hemispheres belonged to the United States. Chiefs' investment in Mexico and Cuba were railroads. The United States and Britain had huge investments in cattle in those regions. Also, the building of the ports in Argentina. They didn't do this to help a needed country. They did this to help themselves and import raw materials and manufactured goods. 6.6 Causing of migration in an interconnected world. Economies have been globalized by industrial revolutions. In some cases, this was a don't, but by economic imperialism. Migration through labor systems. Factories began to strive for more raw materials, so that means growing cash crops, and this is just a ripple effect that goes into more labor systems. As the abolishment of slavery started to rise, they were losing more workers, so this resulted in a low-wage workers from all around the world. Different people working in all different places resulted in mass migration. Another way was through penal colonies, happened mostly in the British, in Australia, and New Zealand. Most migrated in this case of challenges. People moved because of living conditions. Their original areas was awful, so people went there to live a better life. Migration also happened because of establishment, settler colonies. The British established settler colonies in Canada, Africa, and Australia. The people who moved these settler colonies were educated, and this is because they needed well-rounded, educated people to help industrialize these particular areas. In Africa, they industrialized through hospitals and railroads. 6.7 Effects on migration. Migration of the home society. Men leaving their homes to find work elsewhere. This had an effect on gender roles. When people migrated, they brought their culture with them. People in the same culture would find each other in places and form groups dedicated to them. This effect affected some cultural aspects of society, like sometimes food change and languages. Some Chinese made their way home In America, for the gold rush, migration of the receiving society. In some cases, the countries receiving migration would have more of a love-hate relation, but mostly hate. And this happened in Argentina and the United States with the Chinese, but more migrants were willing to work at a low wage to keep their job in the new area. In the United States, it created acts such as the Chinese Exclusion Act. 6.8 Causations in the Imperial Age. These are the 4 reasons for imperialism are money, national pride, racism, and religion. Europeans wanted colonies to provide raw materials for their factories and to sell their goods to new colonies. Some nations wanted to gain colonies to show their national strength. There's economic motives, political motives, religion motives, and exploration motives. They'll all key in together. Migration is a huge important factor, and that's a result in the chapter 6, unit 6.